Oberyn scoffed. Then perhaps I should take my answer another way. Before the King's Guard could react, before Tywin could signal for his men, Oberyn turned on his heel and walked toward Tyrion, whose chains were being removed by a pair of Lannister guards. "You are free, imp," Oberyn said, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, "but you should not remain here." Tyrion rubbed his wrists, glancing warily at his father. "I wasn't planning on it." Oberyn leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Come to Dorne. My brother may be cautious, but he will not turn away a Lannister willing to stand against his own house. And you," his smirk returned, "you have a mind sharper than any sword." Tyrion hesitated, then followed Oberyn's gaze to the royal box, where his father sat motionless. He had never seen Tywin look vulnerable not like this. A lifetime of cruelty and expectations. A father who had never loved him, never respected him. The Lion of Casterly Rock, sitting on his throne of lies. Tyrion lifted his chin. "I believe I would quite enjoy the Dornish sun." Oberyn grinned. "Then let us leave before the snakes strike." The moment he turned, the King's Guard stepped forward, blocking his path. "You will not leave," Sir Meryn Trant growled. Oberyn tilted his head, amused. "Shall I kill another one of your so-called champions? You won the trial?" Meryn snapped. "But you do not get to question Lord Tywin before the court." Oberyn did not flinch. "Then tell me, Sir Meryn, if I walk out of this pit with Tyrion Lannister, who will stop me?" A tense silence filled the arena. The King's Guard were outnumbered. Dornish soldiers in the crowd had already begun to shift in their seats, hands moving to the hilts of their blades. A fight here now would turn the Red Keep into a battlefield. Tywin knew it. The old lion slowly rose from his seat. "Let them go," he said, voice calm but cold. Cersei turned to him in disbelief. "Father!" "Let them go," Tywin repeated. Oberyn smirked. "Wise decision, my lord." With that, he and Tyrion strode from the arena, with the sun burning down on them, and the war for Westeros changed forever. As Oberyn and Tyrion walked through the corridors of the Red Keep, the tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate a man. The trial was over, but the war had only just begun. "You do realize you just declared war on House Lannister, don't you?" Tyrion muttered as he hurried to keep pace with the Red Viper's long strides. Oberyn smirked. "Dorne has been at war with the Lannisters for years. We've just been waiting for the right moment to strike." The halls of the castle were unusually quiet. Too quiet. The guards that normally lined the corridors were missing, and the servants avoided eye contact as they scurried out of sight. Tyrion slowed. Something is wrong. Oberyn noticed it too. He reached for the dagger at his belt and turned to Tyrion. "We need to move faster." Before Tyrion could respond, a group of Lannister guards appeared at the end of the hallway, their hands gripping their swords. They were not Kingsguard, no white cloaks, no ceremonial armor. These were assassins, dressed in the red and gold of House Lannister, but their purpose was unmistakable. Tyrion cursed under his breath. "I should have known my father wouldn't let me walk out of here alive." Oberyn merely grinned, his fingers tightening around his dagger. Tywin Lannister makes mistakes when he's afraid. The lead guard stepped forward. "Prince Oberyn Martell, you are under arrest by order of the hand of the king." Oberyn raised an eyebrow. "I was just in the arena, where I fought legally for trial by combat. I was declared victor. I am leaving." "You do not leave," the guard sneered. "You die." Oberyn chuckled. "Well, that is unfortunate for you." Before the guard could react, Oberyn moved like a shadow. In one swift motion, he threw his dagger into the man's throat, the blade piercing deep, cutting off his scream before it could leave his lips. The other guards lunged, but Oberyn was already in motion. With a dancer's grace, he sidestepped the first attacker, kicking his knee inwards with a sickening crunch. The man collapsed, howling in pain. The second came at him with a sword, but Oberyn twisted to the side, grabbed his wrist, and forced the blade into the guard's own gut. Tyrion, meanwhile, stood frozen, watching the carnage unfold. "I really should start carrying a weapon," he muttered. The last guard hesitated, His confidence shattered as he watched the Red Viper dismantle his men with ease. He turned to run and leap for Oberin to grab the spear of a fallen soldier and hurl it through his back. The silence that followed was deafening. Oberin exhaled and turned to Tyrion, flicking blood from his hands. "Shall we?" Tyrion let out a slow breath. "Yes. Let's leave before my father sends more men who actually know how to fight." They continued through the halls, moving with urgency. Oberin knew Tywin would not let them leave the castle alive if he could help it. The only way to escape was through force. As they turned a corner, they nearly collided with a familiar face. Jaime Lannister. Tyrion froze. Jaime's eyes flickered between his brother and the bodies littering the corridor. His golden hand rested on the pommel of his sword, but he didn't draw it. "Oberyn," Jaime said, his voice unreadable. "Kingslayer," Oberyn replied smoothly. Jaime's gaze settled on Tyrion. "You killed them?" Tyrion sighed. "No, but I certainly encouraged it." Jaime exhaled, shaking his head. He looked tired, as if the weight of his father's commands had drained all the fight from him. "You don't have much time," he said finally. "Father has doubled the guards at the gates. You'll never make it out the main entrance." Oberyn tilted his head. "Then perhaps you should tell us another way out." Jaime hesitated, but something flickered in his expression, something that Tyrion recognized. He was still his brother. Despite everything, despite the Lannister name, there was still a part of Jaime that cared. With a quiet curse, Jaime reached for a set of keys on his belt and tossed them to Tyrion. "There's a passage through the dungeons," he said. "It leads out beyond the walls. Take it and get as far from King's Landing as you can." Tyrion caught the keys, staring at his brother. "Jaime!" Jaime shook his head. "Go, before I change my mind." Oberyn didn't hesitate. He grabbed Tyrion's arm and pulled him toward the dungeons, the weight of war pressing upon them. Tywin Lannister had tried to kill them in the shadows. He had failed. Now, Oberyn would return to Dorne, and, when he came back, it would be with an army. The tunnels beneath the Red Keep were damp and suffocating, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something far worse, rotting flesh. Torchlight flickered against the stone walls as Oberyn and Tyrion moved through the darkness, their footsteps echoing in the silence. "This is an absolutely terrible idea," Tyrion muttered, gripping the keys Jaime had given him. "Terrible ideas have a way of becoming great victories," Oberyn countered, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He was still on edge. Tywin Lannister would not let them slip away so easily. They reached a heavy iron gate, the bars rusted with time. Tyrion fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with sweat. "Any moment now, Lannister men could come storming in to kill us," he muttered, trying key after key. Oberyn grinned. Then opened the gate faster. A click echoed through the corridor as the lock finally gave way. Tyrion pushed the gate open and they slipped through, emerging outside the city walls. The night air was cool against their skin. The sky stretched out above them in an endless sea of stars. Oberyn inhaled deeply, savoring the taste of freedom. "We need to move quickly. Tywin will send riders to search for us." Tyrion adjusted his cloak. "I assume you have a plan?" Oberyn smirked. "I always have a plan." Waiting beyond the hills was a small group of Dornish riders, sent ahead in case Oberyn needed them. Illyria Sand stood among them, relief flooding her face as she saw him approaching. "You're alive," she breathed, grabbing his face with both hands. "You mad, reckless man." Oberyn kissed her, tasting the salt on her lips. "Madness is what keeps us alive." Illyria turned to Tyrion, studying him with amusement. "And what of you, Lannister?" Tyrion sighed. "I'm starting to believe I was safer in chains." Oberyn laughed and mounted his horse. "Then you will enjoy Dorne, my friend. We do not cage those who speak the truth." As the group rode into the night, King's Landing disappeared behind them. But the war they had started was only beginning. Tywin Lannister sat at the head of the war table, his face carved from stone. The candlelight flickered in his cold, calculating eyes. Across from him, Cersei paced like a caged lioness, rage radiating from her every step. "You let them go," she spat. "You had a chance to end this, and you let them walk out of the city alive." Tywin did not look at her. You think I wanted this? Then why didn't you stop them? She hissed. Because I do not fight wars in alleyways, Tywin said, his voice sharp. Oberyn Martell may be reckless, but he is not a fool. He did not act alone. There are forces at play that you do not see. Jaime leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his golden hand catching the firelight. So, what's the plan? We wait until Oberyn returns with an army. Tywin tapped his fingers against the table. We will remind Dorne why they have remained under the Iron Throne for centuries. A messenger entered the chamber, bowing deeply. My lord, Prince Oberyn and Tyrion Lannister have left the city. They are heading south. Tywin's lips pressed into a thin line. Send ravens to the Stormlands in the Reach. We will block their passage before they reach Sunspear. If Oberyn Martell wants war, I will give it to him. Cersei smirked, the fire of vengeance burning in her eyes. Shall we send them a gift? Tywin gave her a measured look. What do you propose? Cersei's smile widened. Something the Martells cannot ignore. If we cannot kill Oberyn, we can break him. She turned to Qyburn, who stood quietly in the shadows. I want Alleria Sand's daughters brought to King's Landing. Let us see how much the Red Viper values his family. Tywin nodded approvingly. Make it happen. The war had begun. By the time Oberyn and Tyrion reached Sunspear, word of their escape had already spread. The Dornish people welcomed them with cheers, but Oberyn knew the battle was far from over. Doran Martell, his older brother and the cautious ruler of Dorne, sat in his chambers, his expression unreadable. You were supposed to return with justice, Oberyn, not war. Oberyn poured himself a glass of wine. Justice and war are the same thing when you are dealing with the Lannisters. Doran sighed. You have forced my hand. They forced ours long ago, Oberyn countered. Dorne was silent for a long time before finally nodding. Then Dorne will fight. But we do not fight alone. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. Meaning, Doran met his gaze. Meaning we will send an envoy to Meereen. Tyrion's breath caught. You mean to bring Daenerys Targaryen into this war? Oberyn grinned. Now, that is a plan I can get behind. The pieces were moving. The war between the Martells and the Lannisters had begun, and for the first time in a long time, the Lannisters were no longer the ones in control. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over Sunspear's domes and towers. The air was thick with anticipation. Word had spread of Oberyn's victory in King's Landing, of his escape, and of the coming war. The people of Dorne had waited long for vengeance, and now their time had come. In the palace, Oberyn stood beside his brother, Prince Doran Martell, on a high balcony overlooking the gathering forces below. Thousands of Dornish soldiers, their spears gleaming under the fading sunlight, filled the courtyards and streets. Their banners rippled in the warm breeze, the golden sun of House Martell shining bright against the red. You have stirred the fire in our people, Doran murmured, his voice heavy with both admiration and worry. But fire is not easily contained, brother, Oberyn smirked. That is precisely why we must let it burn. Tyrion Lannister, seated nearby with a goblet of Dornish wine in hand, watched the exchange with great interest. I must say, seeing Lannister banners burn in the distance would be a sight I'd enjoy immensely. Doran turned his gaze toward Tyrion. You understand that this war will not only weaken the Lannisters, it will reshape the entire realm. Tyrion took a slow sip of wine, savoring the taste. Good. Westeros needs reshaping, and your brother seems quite eager to be the one holding the hammer. Oberyn chuckled. And why shouldn't I be? Tywin Lannister has ruled the realm through fear for too long. He needs to bleed. And he will. Doran let out a weary sigh. We have already sent an envoy to Meereen. If Daenerys Targaryen truly wishes to reclaim her birthright, she will need allies in Westeros. Oberyn's eyes gleamed with excitement. A Martell-Targaryen alliance, just as it was meant to be. Tyrion nodded, setting his goblet down. Daenerys has dragons. Tywin has gold. I'd wager fire and blood will win that battle. But before they could continue, a hurried messenger entered, face pale with urgency. He knelt before the princes, eyes darting toward Oberin. "My lords," the messenger stammered, "a raven has arrived from King's Landing. It bears grave news." Doran took the scroll and unrolled it, his expression tightening as his eyes scanned the words. His grip on the parchment trembled slightly before he looked up at Oberin. "Oberin." Doran's voice was quiet, but the weight of it was like a death knell. "The Lannisters have taken Illyria's daughters." The world around Oberin slowed. A strange, hollow silence filled his ears. The sounds of the soldiers outside, the clinking of armor, the murmuring of strategy all faded. His vision blurred as rage pulsed through his veins. Tyrion's face darkened. "Cersei." Oberin took a slow, measured breath, but his fingers trembled. His entire body felt as if it were on the verge of shattering. "Where are they?" His voice was eerily calm. Doran hesitated. "They are being held in the Red Keep. Cersei demands you return to King's Landing alone, or she will send them back to us in pieces." Illyria, his daughters. Oberin had known war would come, but he had not expected the Lannisters to strike this way. He had expected swords, ambushes, betrayal in the battlefield. Not this. He turned sharply, already moving toward the door. Doran reached for his arm. "Oberin, wait. This is a trap." Oberin wrenched his arm free. "Of course it's a trap. That doesn't mean I won't spring it." Illyria, his daughters. They were his heart, and now the Lannisters had them. Tyrion stood quickly. "Oberin, if you go alone, you will die." Oberin's smile was cold. "Then I will make sure I take as many of them with me as I can." Doran clenched his jaw. "If you march to King's Landing, you will only give them what they want. We must act careful strike at the right moment." Oberin turned to his brother, his voice sharp. "The right moment is now." Doran hesitated, torn between reason and blood. Then, finally, his shoulders sagged in resignation. "If we go to war, we go with everything." A slow, wicked smile spread across Oberin's face. "Then let us go to war." Cersei Lannister sat comfortably on her cushioned chair in the chambers of the Red Keep, sipping wine, a satisfied smirk on her lips. Before her, in the dimly lit room, sat 3 of the Sand Snakes Nymeria, Tyene, and Oberyn bound and gagged. Their eyes burned with hatred, but they could do nothing. "You see," Cersei murmured, swirling the wine in her goblet, "your father thought he could just walk away after humiliating my house." She sighed dramatically. How foolish of him. Qyburn stood nearby, silent as ever, waiting for her command. "Do you think he will come?" Qyburn asked. Cersei smirked. "Of course he will. Oberyn Martell is ruled by passion. It makes him reckless." She took another, slow sip of wine. "And this time, he won't be leaving King's Landing alive." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sir Meryn Trant entered, bowing slightly. "Your Grace, Lord Tywin requests your presence." Cersei sighed, placing her goblet down. She rose and cast one last glance at the Sand Snakes. "Leave them untouched, for now. I want their father to see them alive when he arrives. Then we shall decide what to do with them." As she walked through the halls of the Red Keep, she felt a surge of triumph. She had learned from her father. She had struck first. Now, all she had to do was wait. Oberyn Martell would come for his daughters, and when he did, she would crush him. The army of Dorne moved like a rolling storm, its banners high and its warriors eager for blood. 30,000 spearmen, clad in armor designed for the sweltering Dornish sun, marched under the command of Oberyn Martell. Behind them, cavalry and archers followed, their faces set with grim determination. Oberyn rode at the front, his spear resting against his shoulder, his dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. Every breath he took felt like fire in his lungs. Cersei Lannister had taken his daughters. She had made her move. Now, he would make his. Beside him, Tyrion rode a smaller horse, his expression unreadable. "I must admit," he said after a long silence, "marching an army toward King's Landing is not exactly subtle." Oberyn didn't look at him. "Subtlety is wasted on the Lannisters." Tyrion smirked. "True, but if you think my sister will sit quietly while we ride up to her gates, you may be in for a surprise." Oberyn turned slightly, the edge of a smile playing at his lips. Let her try to stop me. Behind them, Prince Doran's forces moved in tight formation, their banners fluttering in the warm wind. Though Doran himself remained in Sunspear, he had given Oberyn his blessing. If there was to be war, it would not be half-hearted. Dorne would fight with everything. As they rode, scouts returned, with reports of movement ahead. The Lannisters had sent an army to intercept them. Tywin was not foolish enough to sit idle while Dorne marched. How many? Oberyn asked as a scout knelt before him. 15,000 men, my prince, the scout said. They have fortified their position near the Blackwater Rush. Lord Mace Tyrell commands them, with Lannister bannermen under his charge. Oberyn laughed. The Tyrells are leading the fight? Oh, this will be fun. Tyrion, however, looked troubled. The Tyrells have numbers in support. Their knights are well armored, and they control much of the Crown lands. If they hold the river, you'll be forced into a siege. That would give my father time to bring in reinforcements. Oberyn stroked his beard in thought. Then we will not let them hold the river. He turned to his captains. Prepare the men for battle. We attack at dawn. The sun had barely begun to rise when the Dornish struck. Oberyn led the first charge, his spear glinting as he rode through the fog that clung to the battlefield. The Tyrell knights, lined up in perfect formation, expected a conventional assault. They expected the Dornish to fight on open ground, to meet them head-on. Instead, Oberyn used the terrain. His spearmen spread out, weaving through the hills and outmaneuvering the slower, heavily armored knights. Dornish archers, hidden along the cliffs, rained down arrows, forcing the enemy to break formation. Mace Tyrell, commanding from the center, roared for his men to hold, but Oberyn did not give them a chance. He struck from the flanks, his cavalry sweeping into the sides of the Tyrell line like a viper striking its prey. The enemy crumbled under the relentless assault. Tyrion watched from a nearby ridge, shaking his head in admiration. He fights like a man who enjoys war. The battle did not last long. By midday, the Tyrell forces had broken, their survivors fleeing toward King's Landing. The Dornish had won. Oberyn dismounted his horse, his spear dripping with blood. He looked toward the distant city, its towers gleaming in the afternoon sun. Now, he murmured, we march to the Red Keep. Cersei stood at the balcony of the Red Keep, watching as smoke from the battlefield rose in the distance. Her grip tightened around the goblet of wine in her hand. Prince Oberyn has won the battle, Qyburn said quietly. His forces will be here within the week. Cersei turned, her lips curling in a smirk. Let him come. She strode across the chamber, stopping in front of the three bound figures kneeling on the stone floor. The sand snakes Nymeria, Tyene, and Oberyn glared at her with hatred, their wrists bruised from the ropes that bound them. Your father is coming for you, Cersei mused, tilting Tyene's chin up with a single finger. Do you think he will reach you in time? Tyene spit at her feet. He will burn this city to the ground. Cersei chuckled, wiping her hand delicately with a cloth. Perhaps, but you won't live long enough to see it. She turned to Qyburn. Prepare the ravens. I want Oberyn to receive my message before he reaches the gates. Qyburn bowed. And what shall the message say, your grace? Cersei smiled coldly. Tell him if he does not turn back, I will send him his daughters' heads in a box. Oberyn read the letter in silence. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows over his face, but his expression remained unreadable. Tyrion, standing nearby, swallowed hard. Cersei isn't bluffing. She will do it. Oberyn rolled the parchment between his fingers, his jaw clenched, his mind racing. He could not risk their lives. He would not risk their lives. Yet, if he turned back now, he would never get another chance. The Lannisters would remain in power, unpunished. His daughters, or vengeance? For the first time in his life, Oberyn Martell did not know what to do. Tyrion watched him closely. You don't have to do this alone. Oberyn exhaled, glancing at the Dornish banners flapping in the wind. His warriors waited, ready to take King's Landing by force. And then an idea struck him. Slowly, a wicked grin spread across his lips. I won't have to. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. You have a plan? Oberyn turned to the nearest messenger. "Send a raven to Meereen. Tell Daenerys Targaryen we are ready for her dragons." Tyrion's eyes widened. "You're bringing Daenerys into this?" Oberyn's grin widened. "The Lannisters want to play with fire? Then let us see how they handle real fire." And with that, the game had changed. The sun had barely risen when the army of Dorne reached the outskirts of King's Landing. The golden banners of House Martell fluttered in the wind, casting long shadows over the sprawling camps of Dornish soldiers surrounding the city. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, steel, and anticipation. Oberyn Martell sat atop his horse, his spear resting against his shoulder as he gazed at the towering walls of the Red Keep. His daughters were inside, hostages of Cersei Lannister. His enemy was caged, but a caged lion was still dangerous. Beside him, Tyrion Lannister watched the city with a calculating eye. "King's Landing has withstood many sieges before," he muttered. "Starving the city would take months, maybe longer. And if my father still has forces in the Reach, he'll bring them here before we have a chance to breach the gates." Oberyn smirked. "Which is why we are not going to starve them." Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you have in mind?" Oberyn turned toward the horizon, where the faint shadow of sails could be seen approaching from the east. The sea wind carried an eerie silence, broken only by the distant cry of gulls. And then, a roar split the sky. Tyrion's breath caught in his throat. He knew that sound. He had heard the stories. High above them, black wings cut through the clouds as Daenerys Targaryen's dragons descended upon King's Landing. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion soared over the city, their massive forms casting dark shadows over the streets below. The people of King's Landing screamed in terror, running for shelter as the beasts circled the Red Keep. Oberyn's grin widened. "The Lannisters have played with fire for too long." He turned to his men, raising his spear high. "Now they will burn." Cersei Lannister stood at the balcony of the Red Keep, her face pale but determined as she watched the dragons approach. The city beneath her was in chaos. People screamed, soldiers scrambled, and the once mighty Lannister forces now looked weak beneath the shadow of war. Jaime stood beside her, his golden hand clenched into a fist. "You should have let them go," he muttered. "This didn't have to happen." Cersei turned to him, her green eyes blazing with fury. "You think bending the knee would have saved us? Oberyn would have killed us all the moment we surrendered." Jaime shook his head. "Oberyn wanted revenge, yes, but this is madness." Cersei ignored him, turning instead to Qyburn. "Are the preparations ready?" Qyburn hesitated. "Your Grace, there is still time to negotiate." "Answer me," Cersei snapped. Qyburn swallowed hard. "Yes, the wildfire caches remain under the city." Jaime's eyes widened. "Cersei, no." Cersei turned to him, her face unreadable. "If I cannot rule this city, then no one will." Jaime took a step toward her, desperation in his voice. "Think about Tommen. Think about the people. You can still stop this before it's too late." But Cersei's mind was already made up. She had lost everything before. She would not lose again. "Light the wildfire," she ordered. Qyburn hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the halls. Jaime clenched his jaw. He had once killed a king to prevent this very thing, and now his own sister was about to do the same. He had a choice to make. Outside the city, the Dornish forces surged forward, battering against the gates of King's Landing. Ballistae fired from the walls, but they were no match for the dragons circling above. Drogon let out a deafening roar before unleashing a torrent of fire upon the battlements, melting stone and steel alike. The defenders screamed as they burned, the walls of the city cracking under the dragon's fury. Oberyn led his men forward, cutting through the Lannister soldiers with deadly precision. Every strike of his spear was a dance of death, every movement precise and fatal. Tyrion, watching from a safe distance, shook his head. "I almost feel sorry for them," he muttered. "Almost." As the gates of the city finally burst open, the Dornish army flooded into King's Landing, cutting down any Lannister forces that stood in their way. Victory was within reach. But then, a massive explosion erupted from the heart of the city. Flames shot into the sky, turning night into day. Green fire surged through the streets, consuming everything in its path. The wildfire had been ignited. Oberyn's eyes widened as he watched entire buildings crumble, their occupants screaming as they burned alive. This was not war. This was destruction. Tyrion's face went pale. "Cersei, you mad woman." Smoke and fire engulfed the city as the wildfire continued to spread, and suddenly, victory no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered now was survival. The wildfire raged like an unholy storm, consuming everything in its path. Green flames licked the sky, devouring homes, market stalls, and palaces alike. The screams of the dying filled the air, drowning out the clash of steel and the roars of dragons overhead. Oberyn Martell stood amidst the chaos, his face twisted in fury as he watched the city burn. This was not how he had envisioned it. He had come for vengeance, for justice. But Cersei Lannister had turned his war into a massacre. Beside him, Tyrion Lannister stared at the flames, horror etched into every line of his face. "I should have known," he muttered, his voice hollow. "Cersei would rather burn the city than let anyone else have it." Oberyn clenched his jaw. He had fought in countless battles, but never had he seen destruction like this. "We need to reach the Red Keep before it's too late." He turned to his men, his voice carrying over the chaos. "To me! The fight is not over! Cersei dies tonight!" The Dornish forces rallied behind him, pushing through the burning streets toward the castle. Jaime Lannister's heart pounded as he raced through the smoke-filled corridors of the Red Keep. The castle trembled as explosions ripped through its foundations. Cersei had ordered the wildfire ignited, but she had underestimated its power. The entire city was coming down. He found her in the throne room, standing defiantly beside Qyburn as the flames grew closer. "Cersei?" Jaime gasped, coughing from the thick smoke. "We have to go. The Red Keep won't hold much longer." Cersei turned to him, her eyes wild. "We will never surrender." Jaime took a step closer, his voice desperate. "Listen to me. You have to leave. The wildfire is—" A sudden crack echoed through the chamber as the ceiling caved in. A massive stone crashed down, crushing Qyburn instantly. The hand of the queen was dead before he hit the floor. Cersei barely flinched. "This is our city, Jaime! We were born to rule!" Jaime grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "Cersei, it's over. The Martells are here. Daenerys' dragons are burning the streets, and you just destroyed your own kingdom." Cersei's breath came in short gasps, her mind unraveling. No, I win. I always win." But before Jaime could say another word, the doors to the throne room burst open. Oberyn Martell strode inside, his golden spear in hand, his armor smeared with blood and soot. Cersei's face twisted in rage. "You!" Oberyn smirked. "Me!" Jaime stepped protectively in front of her, but Oberyn barely spared him a glance. His eyes were locked onto the Queen of the Ashes. "You wanted to break me, didn't you?" Oberyn murmured, stepping forward. "You stole my daughters. You thought I would kneel, that I would beg." His voice hardened. "But you underestimated me." Cersei's fingers twitched toward her belt. A dagger. A last resort. Oberyn saw it. Before she could react, he lunged. His spear shot forward, piercing straight through her stomach. Cersei gasped, her mouth opening in shock as blood spilled from her lips. She staggered, her fingers clawing at the spear embedded in her body. Oberyn leaned in close, his voice a whisper. "Elia Martell sends her regards." With a sharp twist, he yanked the spear free. Cersei collapsed to the floor, her hands stained red. She coughed weakly, her vision fading. The throne room trembled around her. Jaime dropped to his knees beside her, his golden hand pressing against the wound. "Cersei!" His voice broke. She reached for him, her fingers trembling. "Jaime, don't leave me." Jaime held her as the life faded from her eyes. The Lion Queen was dead. Oberyn turned away, stepping toward the Iron Throne. He ran his fingers along its jagged edges, his eyes distant. The war was over. When the fires finally died down, King's Landing was unrecognizable. Half the city had been destroyed by wildfire. The Red Keep was in ruins, and House Lannister was no more. Oberin stood atop the shattered remains of the throne room, watching as Dornish banners were raised over the city. The war had been won, but at what cost? Tyrion approached him, his face unreadable. "So what now?" Oberyn exhaled, his grip tightening around his spear. "Now, we rebuild." "And who rules?" Tyrion asked. Oberyn glanced toward the horizon, where Daenerys Targaryen's fleet approached. "Not me," he said. "I have had my revenge." He turned to Tyrion with a smirk. "Perhaps it's time for a queen to rule instead." Tyrion raised an eyebrow. "Daenerys?" Oberyn nodded. "Let the dragon and the Sunday rule together," Tyrion chuckled. "Well, I suppose she does have dragons. That tends to make ruling easier." Oberyn's gaze darkened as he looked over the broken city. This war is over, but Westeros will never be the same. Far to the south, in the quiet halls of Sunspear, Illyria Sand held her daughters close. A messenger had arrived that morning with a letter bearing Oberyn's seal. The war is over. The lion is dead. But so is the kingdom she left behind. Illyria closed her eyes, exhaling in relief. Her love had survived. But he had paid a heavy price.